Hi, I'm Rabbi Barry Block, and I'm at Congregation B'nai Israel in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm delighted to talk with you about America's journey for justice. I was so privileged on August 16th to march for 22 miles in, through, and around Athens, Georgia, as the journey made its way from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C. I was especially privileged to march with Keisha Thomas. 20 years ago, when she was just 18, Keisha attended a rally. You see, the Ku Klux Klan was having a demonstration, and Keisha went to a rally to oppose the Ku Klux Klan. And then amongst the anti-Klan marchers was a man wearing a white supremacist t-shirt and with white supremacist tattoos. And somebody yelled out, "Get him!" And people mobbed this man and knocked him to the ground. And Keisha was afraid that this man was going to be killed by an angry mob. We're talking about a white supremacist. Keisha's an African American. She jumped on top of that white supremacist, of that neo-Nazi, and she shielded him, saving his life, protecting his body with her own. Now, 20 years later, a full-fledged adult, Keisha is marching every step of the way from Selma to Washington, D.C. She's marching and calling out every place she goes, "All lives matter." It's terrific that Keisha can call out all lives matter, and she has demonstrated with her life that all lives matter. That not just lives like hers, the lives of African Americans matter, but that everybody's life matters. Unfortunately, you and I, we can't call out all lives matter just yet. We live in an America in which black lives, sadly, do not matter as much as they should in too much of our country. In too much of our country, when an African American, particularly an African American male, commits a crime, he goes to prison for far longer than a white American who commits a similar crime. Ever since the war on drugs began 30 years ago, ever since then, the penalties for the kinds of drug crimes, nonviolent drug crimes that African Americans commit, that poor people commit, those penalties have been much greater than the penalties for crimes that upper middle class people are more likely to commit, that white people are likely to commit. That's why a huge percentage of African American males are in prison today. That's why African Americans are in prison in numbers far, far greater than the percentages of African Americans who commit crimes. An African American who's committed a crime is far more likely to be in prison for far longer than a white American who commits the same crime. That's one of the reasons that Keisha Thomas is marching. At the head of every day's march is a man who calls himself Middle Passage. Well, he calls himself that because that's his name. Now, his parents, his mom and dad, did not name him Middle Passage 70-some years ago. That's a name he took for himself. The Middle Passage, as you probably know, is the name of the primary route of the slave trade from Africa to these American shores. During that horrible journey, African men and women and children who had been taken away from their homes and their families in chains were shackled, unable to move throughout the entire journey, many of them dying along the way and the rest of them facing a fate that many would say was worse than death. You may say, why would an African American in his 70s give himself a name, Middle Passage? He says he gave himself that name because he has to know where he's coming from in order to show where his people, African Americans, are going to. Middle Passage is not just an African American in his 70s, he's a United States military veteran. He's also a father and a grandfather. And he's concerned about the opportunities for his grandchildren growing up in this country. You know, many of you go to public school. And if you go to public school, your public school, I'm guessing, is integrated. There are white people, there are white students, there are African American students, there are students of various races and ethnic origins. However, there are other public schools, likely in your own community, which are attended only by African American children. My son, who's 12, has been conducting a project for his bar mitzvah. He's been tutoring at an elementary school in Little Rock. It's only about a 10 or 15 minute drive from our temple. And yet this is a neighborhood where really only African Americans live, almost exclusively. And guess what? In that school, almost all the students are African American. It's not integrated like the schools that you attend or the schools that my children attend. And you know what? The children who go to those schools, they don't have the same opportunities that you have and that my children have. And that's not to say anything negative about their teachers or about their school administrators. Even the facility's okay. The reality is those children do not go home to parents who are college graduates like most of your parents, like my children's parents. They don't go home to parents who don't have to worry about how they're going to pay this month's mortgage or rent or where the next meals are coming from. They don't go home to parents who have plenty of time and energy and experience to help them with homework. They don't have the same opportunities that you have and that my children have. So whether the issue is criminal justice or it's educational opportunity, whether it's the issues that inspire Keisha Thomas or that inspire Middle Passage, whether they're the issues that Rabbi Lowy talked about, voting rights and others, we live in a divided America where African Americans don't have the same rights, even if they technically have the same legal rights as you and me. I urge you to join me on America's journey for justice. Oh, I realize that it's probably too late and you're not going to actually be going out on the road as the march is today in North Carolina and reaches closer to Washington, D.C. But the journey for justice isn't just an 860-mile walk from Selma to D.C. It's a journey to justice, not just to D.C. Join Rabbi Lowy and me, your rabbis across the region, Reform Jews across North